Hello, I'm Greg with Primal Rights. I'm here today to once again appeal to your common sense, which I guess isn't that common anymore. So instead, maybe I'm going to appeal to your logic. Whichever way you want to look at this, I'm going to try to get you to understand something that is very important if you intend to shoot your very smallest. So if you want to have the best performances that you can have with your precision rifles, this is a concept that you're going to have to come to terms with. If you do not understand this, it will be a permanent roadblock in your shooting career, and you will need to address this before you can move past it. There's a lot of different shooting disciplines out there. The shooting discipline that I am engaged in, I would call field shooting. I am a hunter, and I'm a long-range precision hunter. And so I'm oftentimes making distant shots, or I'm shooting at very small animals very far away. And I need to be able to shoot exceptionally well in order to get that job done effectively. Other disciplines might be in the competition line. For instance, there is different designations for the different competitions out there, such as PRS or NRL. Those are what I would call field practical competitions, where you're shooting at improvised firing positions often. Another one would be your square range disciplines, such as F-class or bench rest. Many of you often look to YouTube, to videos like this, and to other content creators on this platform to learn how you should be doing things. And time again, when I speak to you guys on the phone, I run afoul of you listening to someone that is maybe doing F-class or maybe doing bench rest or something like that, and then you try to apply what they are doing to what you are doing, which is something entirely different. This mistake is very common. Things that are required in order to win in competition might not be the best things for you to be doing if you're out here trying to make one round count. And that one round needs to land perfectly in order for you to have success. So you can't compare what you're doing in that situation, what reloading techniques you should be doing to make that situation successful, to what someone that is shooting on a square range, the same square range or the same series of square ranges all the time, that are lined up and down both sides with wind flags, and they get sighters. Okay, that means they get to fire shots to see where things are hitting before they actually shoot for record. These differences in disciplines, folks, okay, we don't get sighters. In my discipline, there's an animal out there. That bullet's going to track perfectly with that firing solution. We need to know that no little variable, like a change in atmospheric conditions or maybe a round that didn't get loaded just perfectly. Maybe there was a discrepancy or a problem in the uniformity of the brass or the bullet, or maybe we accidentally got the wrong powder charge, got a couple extra kernels in there. We need to know that none of that stuff is going to affect our performance. And so when we are hand loading at the bench, we're hand loading using techniques that are guaranteed to produce the reliability of the success that we need and that the target animal deserves. Now, the reason that I bring this up is because there's a trend amongst square range shooters to push cartridges super hard. These guys, a lot of times, will throw their brass in the garbage after 3 or 5 firings. And the reason is they're running like 100 foot per second over what I would recommend those cartridges be run at. Now, I don't agree with this choice. Personally, I think that there's no reason why they should do that, but I don't compete in F-class. So it isn't for me to say what those guys should be doing, because if there's an accuracy problem, they can detect it while they're firing their sighters. If there's a point of impact shift that's coming as a result of their brass getting hit with too much pressure, they can just fire sighters and figure it out. And so it's not detrimental to them to play around like this, to run higher pressures. If they run higher pressures and they kind of whack their bolt open a little bit in order to get that case out of there, most of them are okay with that because they're fine with the ballistic advantage that they're getting against their competitor over here. Out here, when we're engaging these animals, that is not something that we want. We want the opposite. We want things to be very forgiving. We want things to go as smoothly as possible because there's enough variables out here in the environment, folks. We want ammunition so that if we get rained on or if our rifle gets a bunch of ice in it or something like that, that we can still fire that round, and that round is going to land exactly where we expect it to land. It's going to track properly with the firing solution that we've generated. Running right on the edge of pressure or up into pressure at all is a really good way to make sure that that reliable, consistent performance never happens. This is a message that many of you that have come to this channel have been getting for well over a decade now. This is not a new thing that I've been saying. I have countless videos on brass health and why it's not a good idea to be running over pressure. And the two things are directly connected. The health of your brass, if you're running over pressure, it doesn't matter what else we're doing in the reloading room here or what kind of equipment we have. If you're running over pressure, there's nothing that you can do to prevent that brass from being destroyed, from the uniformity amongst that brass to be destroyed. Even after all that content and all that work and effort that I put in, you still don't get it. You still think that having an extra 25 or an extra 50 or an extra 100 foot a second is somehow going to give you that edge that you've always been missing. That's what's going to make you have more hits. Now, I know, just as many of you watching this already know, that that is not true. There's nothing that could be further from the truth. Pushing your cartridge beyond its effective capability is going to bring with it a non-uniformity that will result in universally worse performances and more misses. Well, if you're a visual learner, this video is going to be for you. And for those of you that already know what I'm talking about here, and you already believe that, well, then this video would be great to send to one of your buddies that doesn't understand this. They still think that extra velocity means more hits. So if they just push their cartridge just a little bit harder, then they can get those hits that they want so much. Here's a nice little fact for you. In my entire career, I have never seen a rifle with a cartridge that is being loaded at its upper end of its capabilities produce the best performance. Meaning, yes, it may be the highest velocity, but the accuracy and precision and the repeatability and predictability of those results is almost universally worse when we're running right there at the upper end of the cartridge's capabilities. A big reason why is that the brass simply cannot take those elevated pressures. And while there isn't enough pressure to cause the brass case to fail or to cause the gun to come apart like a grenade, it doesn't change the fact that the expansion that is taking place during the firing event is still too high for the brass to deal with. So as you fire these things, the firing event happens, there's a small explosion inside there. The brass expands, the barrel tenon expands, the front band on the action expands, and that expansion has to be within a reasonable limit of the design of this whole system in order for the brass to expand and then spring back effectively to its correct size and shape. If that expansion is too great, the brass will yield. The expansion will be more than the structure of the brass can handle. And when that happens, you feel what is known as heavy bolt lift. It means as you go to open the bolt, that lifting of the bolt handle is harder than it would be if you just loaded a round and then immediately ejected it without firing it. All things being equal, there should be next to no perceptible difference when you fire a round and then go to lift the bolt. It should feel almost the same. There might be a little more resistance than if you didn't fire the case and just ejected the live round. It should be pretty close. Whereas if you've got a large difference there and you go to lift the bolt handle and it's like, hey, this thing is a lot harder to lift than it would be if it was empty or if I was just ejecting a live round. That heavy bolt lift is indicative of the brass having grown larger than the cavity that contains it. So it grew bigger than the chamber, and it's wedged in there now, and that's why the bolt is lifting heavy, because there's a ton of pressure against the bolt lugs caused by having this brass case wedged in there that is too large. So that's the first indication that the brass has yielded, is when you're lifting the bolt and it's heavy. There's other signs of pressure, obviously, that we're not going to get into here. The point of this is once the brass goes to that point, even if you don't necessarily feel it, this can happen even if you don't feel dramatically heavy bolt lift, because it's a relationship. If the brass starts out too small, you have an oversized chamber in there, well, you could have the brass yield as a result of a too large of a difference between its virgin state and the fired state. So this is all a very intimate relationship between the brass and the chamber and the load that you're running. And if you get it wrong, you can damage the brass. Once that damage has taken place, there is no coming back. It is permanent. We can't anneal the web of the case, and so we can't bring it back to neutral. It has expanded, it has yielded, it's plastically deformed, it's not coming back, and it will never be the same as a different piece of brass that hasn't happened to. Now, these changes in the brass's integrity result in a behavior change in how the brass deals with the next firing event, because it's not the same as the others anymore. And if any of those cases are shot with the other cases where that hasn't happened, they will universally shoot differently. Now, for most of you, if you're shooting on the plus side of half MOA, half to 3/4 MOA or something like that, you probably won't notice this point of impact shift. You probably won't actually see the difference that the brass is making. Now, if we take this to the extremes and we're dealing with very large pressure differences, well, even if you're shooting half MOA, technically speaking, this could work its way into your shooting and show a variance in point of impact. So if you're currently shooting half MOA or third MOA or something like that, and you'd like to get that third MOA to be more consistent, where that's like the worst that you're shooting, or if you'd like to start creeping down into quarter MOA territory, or maybe even a little bit better, this is one thing that you're going to have to understand. You can't push this brass that hard and still have it perform in a reliable enough, consistent enough way to deliver those type performances. Now, I have repeatedly demonstrated my capabilities with a precision rifle for well over a decade here on this channel. And at this point in time, I've never cared less about what people think about me or how I'm shooting with a precision rifle than I am caring about that today. I literally just don't care about that. Now, having said that, I do like to continue showing those demonstrations to make sure that you guys are setting your goals properly, that you're able to see that if you adopt the principles that I show in this channel, what kind of performances you can come to expect as average. I don't necessarily show the very best examples of what I'm able to do with a precision rifle here. Frankly, I don't really like doing that. And the reason is because the best is only happening 1 to 5% of the time, right? It's just these individual occurrences that show themselves to be beyond exceptional. What I'm really excited to share, though, is the average performance. What it looks like when things are going as expected, meaning how a rifle's responding, how my loading techniques are working when it's just average, where it's behaving in an acceptable manner that makes me happy. Now, here's another one of those examples. I just grab a rifle, lay down, put a camera on the target at the 100-yard line, put a camera on me so you guys can watch how I'm mechanically operating the rifle. And this should give you some idea that, hey, this is not some unattainable level of performance. This is actually quite easy. if you follow what I have outlined here on this channel.
And get the wind figured out on the first couple and go from there. Yeah.
So those are 1/2 inch dots down there at 100 yards. And I'm happy when I can hit 20 in a row. That makes me quite happy. I'm confident in how the rifle's performing. I have enough shots in sequence, even if I miss 1 or 2 or maybe up to 4 of the dots. But the misses aren't like 2 or 3/10 of a mil away. They're just like 1/10 of a mil right off the very center. Now, 1/2 inch dot means that in order to hit the dot, you need to be performing to at least a 1/3 MOA with most bullet diameters. Now I'm shooting a 22 caliber in this video. I could hit the dot with a larger bullet and be shooting worse than 1/3 MOA, or at least worse than 1/4 MOA. But the smaller the bullet diameter requires that I hit closer to the center in order to hit the dot. So if it's a 1/2 inch dot at 100 yards, and a 1/10 of a mil is 0.36 inches, then I know in order to be keeping my performance inside of a 1/10, any direction from the center of point of aim, I need to hit that dot. I can't let that shot slip outside of that dot. I need to have hit it. And if I can get a rifle performing like that, I'm pretty happy. It's always nice when you're blazing the center out of those little black dots where the bullet is completely inside the black and perfectly centered. It looks like somebody went down there and hole punched the middle out. I still haven't been able to get there. I'm pushing towards that, but I haven't been able to have 20 shots in a row where the very center was blown out, where I hit not kind of in the middle, but the very middle, where the bullet tip landed within a 1/16 of an inch of the very center of the dot. I haven't done that to date. Now, I have hit all 20 dots lots of times. Like, that is pretty common, I'd say. 18 of these 1/2 inch dots, that's super, super common. 16, I'm okay with that, depending on how hard the wind is blowing outside. But if you guys are interested in shooting this target for yourself, you can go to the library section of the Primal Rights website, and library, and then downloads, and this 1/2 inch dot drill target will be in there. And so you just put it up at 100 yards and shoot 1 shot at each dot. And it'll tell you a lot about yourself. It'll tell you a lot about your rifle system. And I'd encourage you all to go and do that at least once. I shoot these dot drills as a matter of course. Every time I shoot at 100 yards, it's typically at one of these dot drills. It's an extremely practical way to keep on top of yourself and where you're currently at in your shooting capability. So the long and short of it here, folks, is if you're not keeping on top of your brass health, you cannot have these kinds of performances. It simply will not happen. And if you are able to do that with the first firing or maybe the second firing, there will be a certain number of firings. If you're pushing your brass too hard and you're running too high velocities, you'll get to a point where very early on, and I'm not talking after 10, 12, or 15 firings or something, I'm talking within 5 to 7 firings probably, you will see the inability to produce that performance continue. So you'll go through firing after firing, and pretty soon you'll find that the brass just doesn't work right anymore. And that is likely because of something that you're doing wrong at the load bench, you're not using the right equipment or the right techniques, or you're running over pressure and you're damaging the brass every time you fire it. I know a lot of you out there are going to say,
who cares if my brass gets wrecked? I'll just buy new brass.
And then everybody wonders why they're constantly chasing a tenth or 2/10 of a mil of zero around all the time. Why you can never seem to have the same zero on your rifle from one session to the next. It's bad enough that many of you don't know how to properly drive a rifle to ensure that that doesn't happen. But even if you're driving the rifle perfectly and you're brutalizing your brass like this, that point of impact shift is going to come anyways. So gather around, children. We're going to look at some pretty pictures now, and maybe you'll start to understand how fruitless and pointless you pushing your cartridges beyond their limit actually is in the real world. Now, once again, if you'd like to follow along with this and create some ballistic comparisons of your own, I'd recommend you download the Applied Ballistics app on your phone, or use the Applied Ballistics in your Kestrel or something like that. Create the firearm profile, create the ammunition profile, and start doing ballistic calculation comparison yourself. Now, the first cartridge we're going to talk about is the 223AI, or 223 Ackley Improved. I have personally enjoyed running the 223 Ackley. These days, I don't really find much use for it. I'm a much bigger fan of the BRA line of cartridges, so I don't really have a need for a 223 Ackley. And if I'm going to run the 223 bolt face, I generally want to run it in a 20 cal, something like a 204 Ruger or something like that. But we need to pick a cartridge here that's on the baseline, that's kind of on the lower side of 22 caliber performance. And I understand there's lots of cartridges that are smaller than the 223 Ackley. You know, this is just one that the precision rifle community has grown to kind of adore over the years, so why not take a look at it? Now, you can see by the way this graph is laid out, we're going to be doing a comparison here using the same bullet, but at different velocities. The first velocity is going to be what I feel to be a pretty easy to achieve velocity with this particular bullet in this cartridge. So if we were to say across the totality of my experience, where has the velocity landed with a bullet like this in a 26-inch barrel? Then I'm going to add 100 feet per second to that number. And we're going to compare those two. Most of the time, a 100 foot per second jump over a standard operating load is going to be very unsafe, very dangerous. Okay, so do not do that. The reason that I'm doing a 100 foot per second jump is to show best case scenario. So I'm actually giving the overpressure hot rod crowd all the benefit of the doubt here. And I'm saying, hey, let's just say you could get 100 foot per second faster than the normal load. What would that look like? Would it be practical to do then? Now, the line graph on the left is showing the elevation requirement. So how much drop we've got here from 100 yard zero. On the right, we have the wind in the bar graph, comparing the normal, boring, average, slow load to the, hey, this is crazy overpressure, you really shouldn't be doing this load. At 500 yards, the 223 Ackley with an 80 grain Berger VLD is only showing 0.2 of a mil of advantage in elevation. The gap gets opened up quite a bit by the time we get to 1,000 yards, but it's still not something that's going to result in any perceptible change in performance. Now, these charts are being delivered to you in mils because the mil system is what I prefer. Those of you that are shooting MOA, you would just multiply these numbers by 3.5 and you get your minutes. As you can see, this is just not a very big difference. When we look at the wind, it's literally identical until we get to 1,000 yards. And we gain 1/10 of a mil in the wind with a .22 caliber at 1,000 yards. Folks, it might as well be exactly identical. Now, you know from the previous video that an elevation change here is not going to deliver perceptibly better results in the world when the differences are this small. It's one thing when we start talking about 1.5 mil or 2 mils of elevation difference, then that might be demonstrative of something that's going to actually make a difference to us and allow us to hit out there in the world. But when the difference is this small, folks, you're not going to see any tangible benefit. So there's no real advantage that would justify torturing your brass and wrecking your brass. And along with wrecking your brass comes the point of impact shift variance and the general unpredictability of the entire system. Next up is the 22 BRA. Now, this is a cartridge that you guys that have watched the channel frequently know that I absolutely love. Now, I've got a 3,100 foot per second launch velocity listed here, and we generally get more performance than that. But again, I want to demonstrate the difference between like, hey, this is a super easy load to get to that just about anybody with even a not so fast of a barrel is going to have an easy time getting, and compare that to a velocity that almost no one is going to get. So we've got the exact same bullet, the 80 grain Burger VLD, but this time we're running at 3,100 foot a second and 3,200, demonstrating the overpressure. And the same story plays out. We have a tiny, tiny advantage on elevation, and then we have a virtually indetectable difference at range in the wind. Okay, what if we crank the power up a little bit? Let's go to the 22 Creedmoor. Let's step on the gas here. Now, 22 Creedmoor will hit 3,400 foot a second with boring regularity with an 80 grain VLD. Again, very easy to achieve that velocity with the correct components in most 26-inch 22 Creedmoor barrels. So 3,400 foot a second. Now, conversely, 3,500 is going to be well above what I would recommend most barrels run at. But yet the exact same thing is going on. There's next to no perceptible difference here between these two in terms of how they're performing that would justify the premature destruction of your brass and flirting around with unsafe loads that would potentially blow up your rifle or lock your action shut. Folks, if you're running right on the edge of pressure like that, let's say you're running an 80 grain VLD and a 22 Creedmoor at 3,500 foot a second. All it would take is for a rainstorm to happen or for some ice, like you get some moisture, maybe some snow on your rifle when you're out coyote hunting, and then you hop in the pickup and it kind of melts a little bit and gets in there, maybe forms a little bit of a puddle in your chamber. Then you go back out in that cold condition and it freezes that in there. So now you've got this ice in your chamber filling the space around your cartridge, because when the water froze, it expanded and filled the voids. So you would go from shooting the normal charge weight and it would be like, ooh, that's overpressure if you shot that round in that situation. Like, yikes, a little heavy bolt lift on that one. But if you're running at that upper echelon of speed, that's not a little whoopsie daisy. That's your hunt's over. You just locked your action shut and you need to go home and beat it open with a 2x4 or a rubber hammer or something. And that's best case scenario. Or you're done hunting because you're on your way to the emergency room. Okay? So if 100 foot a second doesn't make any practical difference, and that's the difference between running a super easy load and a viciously hot load, and most of you will not get an extra 100 foot a second out of the cartridge, then what's the point of running an even marginally hot load that delivers like an extra 40 or 50 foot a second? We're demonstrating here that 100 foot a second doesn't give you anything practical. So why do you need to have another 30 or another 40 or another 50 or 70 foot a second when even 100 doesn't do anything? Cranking the speed up to Mach Hallelujah is the 22 PRC Primal shooting that same 80 grain Burger, but this time we're launching it at 3,600 foot a second, which is pretty easy to get to. the overpressure is 3,700 foot a second. Now, I'd like to say that the velocities listed here are merely being used as a demonstrational guide. I am making no proclamations of what you're going to be getting in your exact rifle, because a fast barrel to slow barrel discrepancy, even from the same manufacturer, can be in excess of 100 or 150 foot per second. So pressures are what they are, and they're as a function of all the components that you're using in the exact barrel that you've got on this rifle, the exact conditions that you're loading and shooting it in. That's what's going to determine these velocities. Now, these bigger wildcats like this, even starting with the 22 Creedmoor and certainly in the 22 PRC Primal, you have to understand also that small changes are going to create a much larger variable in the process, a different result than on tame cartridges. So while I can speak about the velocities in the 223 Ackley and the 22 BRA with much greater certainty, the 22 Creed and the 22 PRC Primal are big enough and a little bit wild enough to where you might have early pressure or late pressure be dictated by the exact burn characteristic of your powder. Because getting the balance right for something that's a little bit hairy like that is harder than a super forgiving cartridge would be. So it doesn't matter how much we step on the gas and how much velocity we are starting with. By the time we show 100 foot a second variance, we're gaining nothing practically in the world. There's no real difference that's going to show up in our ability to make hits out there. Because no matter how fast we go, there's only ever a tenth of a mil at 1,000 yards in the wind. And folks, with a bigger cartridge, with larger bullets that are higher BC and more slippery, this difference is even less in many cases. How close can we get to the next cartridge up? Because it's pretty obvious here. If you want more speed, you go to a bigger cartridge. Nothing else changed. We just have the same bullet here, but we're using a bigger cartridge that has more authority. And now we see an extremely perceptible actual and practical difference in performance. Now, if you look at the elevation graph and you look at the wind graph, it's very obvious. We take a step up in cartridge and we gain access to a whole new range of capability. When we start talking about 2 or 3 or 4 tenths of a mil better in the wind, we're talking about something that's practical here. We're actually going to see a benefit from that in the real world. We're going to have more hits. Now let's look instead at the orange data, which is the max charge, like way over pressure. Nobody ever should operate here, but let's look at that data. So I've got that shown here in the same color, but slightly subdued. And you'll see that it's barely even a half step towards the next cartridge. So the data speaks for itself here. Pushing a cartridge beyond its capabilities is going to bring with it such a huge host of negative side effects that no one should ever be pursuing it. Conversely, if what you're after is more performance, and that's what you'd like, then you need to go to a bigger cartridge in order to get that performance. Because running a low charge in a larger cartridge is going to be very stable and repeatable. Whereas running a high charge in a little cartridge is not going to be stable, is not going to be repeatable. So if you've got a buddy that's just obsessed with getting as much velocity as he can out of every cartridge he runs, you need to duct tape him to a chair, tape his eyelids open, and force him to watch this video. I'm just kidding. Don't do that. That's not nice. But you get the drift. So stop chasing speed with powder, folks. If you want more speed, go to a bigger cartridge. Today I'm going to read to you from 2 Peter 1, and we'll start with verse 3 here. By his divine power, God has given us everything we need for living a godly life. We have received all of this by coming to know him, the one who called us to himself by means of his marvelous glory and excellence. And because of this glory and excellence, he has given us great and precious promises. These are the promises that enable you to share in his divine nature and escape the world's corruption caused by human desires. In view of all this, make every effort to respond to God's promises. Supplement your faith with a generous provision of moral excellence, and moral excellence with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with patient endurance, and patient endurance with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love for everyone. Acknowledging here how we came to be in God's grace, how much love He has for us to have sent His only Son to die for us, to ensure that we can be placed with Him in heaven. Along with that comes guidelines. Now, a lot of Christianity has been infected with the concept that somehow, if you believe in Jesus Christ, then that allows you to do anything that you want otherwise and be as despicable as you want and never aim for anything, going through life acting like a scumbag to everybody. Oh, you believe in Jesus Christ, so that now you're saved. It doesn't matter what else you do here. That's not actually true. Many of you might not know this because you're not reading the Bible. You're certainly not reading the New Testament, because in the New Testament, where the new covenant, God's sacrifice of His Son for us, Jesus was here telling us the rules. Now, all throughout the Gospels, you can see Jesus saying, if you do this, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. If you don't do this, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So there was warnings all throughout talking to us about our behavior and saying our behavior has a bearing on whether or not we will enter His kingdom. So this concept that you can believe in Christ, believe in God, and somehow that grants you access to heaven, that is wrong. That is not how it works. The Bible is explicit in saying that it does not work that way. You must follow the guidelines set forth in the Bible for us. Now, if you do that, if you follow those guidelines, then not only will you be ensured entry into heaven, but you will also have God's promises being fulfilled in your life here on this earth during your life. Now, this is where the really exciting stuff starts happening because, folks, God gave tons of promises. The Bible is filled with God saying, if you do this, then I will do this for you, up to and including, if you will have faith but the size of a mustard seed, you could command this mountain to throw itself into the sea, and it would. That means you can literally move mountains if you have faith. Now, that is just one of the promises. That is just one of the things that is said. And it's something that sticks in my mind frequently to make sure that I never let this world grind down my hopefulness, grind down what I think I'm capable of, my self-image, my worth, my capability. I will never look to this world to tell me what those things are. Instead, I will look to God. I will look to the Scripture to tell me what those things are. Now, this verse, it says that these are promises that enable you to share in His divine nature. So these promises that God made to us says that if we do these things, He will bring us closer. He will share with us His divine nature. Now, God can do whatever He wants. He thinks it, and it happens. What this verse is saying is that the same thing applies to you. If you let the chaos and corruption of this world pollute your heart, harden your heart, limit your scope of what you think is capable, then you'll be capable of less. If you believe what God has promised, you'll be capable of more. And it goes on to say, in light of this unbelievable gift, the reality that God is sharing His divinity with us in that capacity, take every effort to better yourself. Take every opportunity to do better, to guard yourself against hardening, to expand your horizons, not shrink them, to expand your knowledge, to expand your love. It goes on to say that you prop up the one thing with the next thing, the way that it goes through all that you're supposed to do. Moral excellence should be propped up with knowledge. Knowledge should be propped up with self-control. Self-control with patient endurance, and on it goes. So it's telling you exactly how you're supposed to be were you but to listen. If you encounter a Christian that thinks that they can behave any way that they want because they're a Christian, you know that you're not actually dealing with a Christian. You're dealing with somebody that's playing at being a Christian. Now, I've had people talk with me at length about Christian principles, about the Bible. But then they break their word to me. They do something that is totally unlike the Christian that is defined within the Bible. They're practicing a behavior that is giving them worldly satisfaction, or that they are using the world to justify, but it doesn't change the fact that they broke their word. They said something, and then they didn't follow through. Well, those people that think that they can sit in the grace of God haven't read the Bible at all. Because that type of behavior only leads to one thing, and that is hell itself. When you're behaving in a way that is in league with Satan, you're going to end up with him for all eternity. The Bible is specific about this. Don't go and read the parts of the Bible that talk about God's grace and his love and all of that, and then forget all of the parts of the Bible that talk about what you're supposed to do, and if you don't do it, you will have no grace. Now, the only way to get to heaven is through your relationship with Jesus Christ. No one goes to God except through him. So your belief in Jesus Christ is required. But that is not the only thing that's required. Now, just so you know that I'm not making this up, I'm going to read to you from Matthew 7, verse 21. Here is Jesus himself talking. Not everyone who calls out to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only those who actually do the will of my Father in heaven will enter. Now, there's many pieces of scripture that deal with what you must do in order to get to heaven. The scripture says that if you don't do these things, you will not get to heaven. And that if you're caught doing these other things, you will not enter his kingdom. Now, this one piece of scripture that I've shared with you here says in no uncertain terms, only those that do the will of God will enter heaven. And it is God's will that we follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. And those teachings are spelled out in the Bible. Now, it would really break my heart for many of you that enjoy these segments that I'm sharing with you to think that modern religion is right, when in actuality, religion has nothing to do with being a Christian. Being a Christian has to do with living out the teachings of Jesus Christ in your life. That is what it means to be a Christian. And here we have Jesus himself saying, you will do the will of my Father in heaven, or you will not enter heaven. He is the gatekeeper, folks. He is the only one that allows us in or denies us entry. And he is telling us exactly what we need to do in order to gain entry. Belief in Jesus Christ is one of those things. Worshiping properly is one of those things. Being baptized is one of those things. There's many things that we are to do. But along with that comes the teachings of Jesus Christ himself. We are to follow his example. We are to put his teachings to work in our own lives and live in such a way that when others look upon our life, they see his teachings borne out in how we behave. Those of you out there that think that you can do and say whatever you want, that you can commit to things and then break your word, you will never enter heaven. Because when you break your word to someone, you are demonstrating that you care more for yourself than you do for the other person. So if you read the New Testament and you find things in there that are convicting you, that's good. Because it's telling you all of the things that you need to change before you die so that you can enter the kingdom with Jesus. Do not shrink from the conviction. Embrace the conviction and just change. Do not be afraid to change, because as you change, the more that you do the will of God, the more His promises will be delivered to you. And God never breaks His promises. So the more you obey, the better your life will go. Thank you for watching this message. I hope you have a wonderful and blessed week.